Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by John Speed Meyers. John Speed, thanks for being here, man.
Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really excited to chat with you. As I mentioned in the post I made, I've been, kind of following and citing your research, and we've never even spoke before, live until today. But for folks that don't know you, haven't come across some of your work and your research and publications, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, glad to. I'm really a public policy researcher by background, doing all sorts of research for the U.S. military, especially the Air Force and Army, a number of think tanks. And when I realized that weapon systems were really just computers with metal wrapped around them, I started to get more and more interested in software, computer networking. So I took a set of quantitative research skills and started applying it to computer security. And eventually software supply chain security when I was working at an organization called In-Q-Tel. And just a year ago, I went to help start a research lab within a startup focused on software supply chain security at a company called ChainGuard. And that's where I currently am.
Yeah, very cool. You have a really interesting background, a blend of, kind of academic research, but practitioner involvement too. So I'm excited to chat with you about it. That's how I came across you, actually, is I found some research. I was writing a book about software supply chain security recently. And
I pre-ordered it.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I found some of your research and publications back when you were with In-Q-Tel, I want to say, but it was about the kind of the spike and rise in software supply chain attacks. And
yeah,
okay, this is great stuff. And then, I've just been following your content ever since.
Oh, I appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. So I wanted to ask, obviously software supply chain is getting a ton of attention now. Obviously we've had like SolarWinds and Log4j, and everyone's talking about software supply chain, but you seem to be doing some research on that, several years ago, basically, before it kind of got to mainstream. What led you down that path, and how did you get going on the topic?
Yeah, the embarrassing truth is failure led me there. I was doing research on network traffic analysis in 2019 and 2020, and I realized that my research skills weren't actually making much headway in this area. And it's really a sordid story, but I pissed off the software engineers around me enough that I realized I probably need to do something different. I was always complaining about the data quality and data access and all these things. And I realized that the area that solved my data availability problems was open source software. It's a fantastic and huge world just waiting to be mined. But it's not actually designed for research. It's designed for the ease and availability for often software developers. And so I got into it by studying the open source software ecosystem because honestly, it just seemed interesting. And you're right, it wasn't nearly as popular a topic. And I think some of my coworkers doubted me at the time.
Yeah, I think that's actually going to take us right now in the direction I wanted to chat with you about on the open source software topic is, obviously you've been doing a lot of research in this space around open source software and software supply chain. And, there's kind of this, I don't want to say debate or dichotomy in the industry about open source versus proprietary. And,
Sure.
A lot of people will, cite like Linus's law, which is, where I forget exactly how it's phrased, but like under enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I started researching, for the book, and I was realizing that like an overwhelming majority of open source software projects are maintained by, a single or a very small group of individuals.
Right.
I'm curious your thoughts, like based on your research, we've seen a ton of open source software adoption. Do you feel that, that kind of, bust factor, as they call it, I guess, right, is a concern when we think about software supply chain security?
Yeah, I do think it's a concern. I think something to unpack that. I think it gets more complex because what I'm afraid of is just that adding more people, adding more eyes to any given project is not actually that effective, at least not in a short-term burst. And that's because software, and to find its vulnerabilities, often requires a relatively deep contextual understanding. And that comes from long-term commitment and involvement in the project, a thorough grounding in security principles. And so I do think it's a problem, and I think it's a harder problem to solve than commonly assumed, because simply adding more eyeballs is potentially ineffective, at least on theoretical grounds. You really need the right eyeballs, and those right eyeballs aren't just simply smart people or good programmers. It's people that have a very specific set of contextual knowledge and security skills. So it's a tough issue. For better or worse, it's not hampering open source software adoption, though. And that's not necessarily a good thing. But it's clear that all software, proprietary, our large open source projects are themselves stuffed full of other open source software projects. So for better or worse, it is the state. Many projects do have one or very few maintainers, and it creates issues like should the key maintainer leave the project becomes unmaintained and therefore not updated. And as security bugs arise and new updates arise, they don't get incorporated in the project. It leads to the threat that there's just too little time for, even if there is a core committed container, to doing bug updates, security updates, hardening the project. So it's an issue. I don't have easy answers, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated problem, and as you point out, I kind of think it's a good thing you point out. Like, more eyeballs doesn't necessarily solve it. If you look at like CISA's known exploited vulnerability list, for example, the top culprits on the list are some of the most well-resourced and staffed organizations in the world, but also some of the most widely used pieces of software in the world. So it's a very complicated issue. Yeah. Another thing I wanted to ask you about on the open source software front, I know you're with ChainGuard now, and you've been doing a lot of focus on software bill of materials, or SBOM, as we call it. And you had produced a study fairly recently about, you took a look at the state of open source software, SBOMs, for example, I think it was, and how they lined up to, say, the NTIA, minimum elements for SBOMs as defined by NTIA. I'm curious, like, what started you down the path of the study, and what were some of the findings that you think might be interesting for the community?
Yeah, for me, I think a key question that a lot of people in the SBOM community, and I know that, in fact, you're in some sense part of that community and well connected to those, is why aren't SBOMs everywhere? And I think a lot of discussion about SBOMs among this committed group of persons boils down to that question. And one of the reasons that question became so pertinent to me last fall is there was a bunch of government activity, and specifically one Office of Management and Budget memo that seemed to indicate the possibility of making SBOMs mandatory as part of federal procurement. And you might have seen a trade organization letter by the Information Technology Industry Council that argues against this requirement for a number of reasons, but it's certainly implied by the letter that SBOMs are immature. And so I said to myself, well, in some sense, how true is this? How does one know if SBOMs are immature, if they're low quality? Yeah, exactly. That's it. And I know you know it. And so really at that time, I said, well, this is perfect. I have this claim that, as far as I can tell, no one's actually examined, or if they haven't made anything public about it. But now I have new problems. I need to have some notion of SBOM quality, which it's not obvious, though the NTIA minimum elements are helpful. And I need to have a bunch of SBOMs. So in the process, I actually created a couple SBOM data sets. I jokingly, you can find them on ChainGuard's GitHub. I call them bomb shelter. One is a data set of open source project SBOMs, literally SBOMs released by open source projects, not created by me, and simply uploaded usually in the GitHub releases page. And then another is a set of a few thousand SBOMs that I created. I took very popular Docker Hub containers and I used a bunch of SBOM generation tools. So it gave me a few thousand. And there's a couple different ways to analyze SBOM quality, it turns out. But I focused because it's easier on data field availability, what you see from NTIA minimum elements. Is there this type of data for all the packages in an SBOM, and a couple other things too? And the short answer is that there is actually a lot of rich data in SBOMs. They're not just a bunch of no assertion fields or something that's just laughable. But it is true that very few are fully compliant with NTIA minimum elements. I don't think that means they're immature, but there certainly is a way to go. So that's kind of my glass half full interpretation.
Yeah, so I guess not to take us down like a philosophical or kind of ethical debate, but I do want to unpack this topic a little bit, because I thought it was interesting. On one hand, their pushback makes sense because it is immature, right? It is something that's new and emerging and needs to be fleshed out to some extent. But at the same time, the alternative is, kind of the federal government just keeps blindly procuring software with no visibility of what's inside of it. And that didn't seem like a very viable path either. So I'm curious, like, without maybe stepping on any landmines, how much do you think the SBOM pushback is warranted versus, maybe people just reluctant to provide transparency, unless they absolutely must do it,
Yeah. So, I mean, I won't even try to guess at people's intentions because I truly don't know. I really am kind of a nerd in a closet doing research. So I don't know. But I will say that the research I've done suggests that it's an overblown concern. Um, and though I do want to acknowledge one other aspect, which is, and this is some research I've been working on that's forthcoming, but I think there's like another question which is not just what data isn't there, but are the right components actually listed? And I think that's actually a deeper and more difficult problem, but there is actually interesting ongoing research on this. It's all early and percolating. But I think the most important part is you can find holes and issues with SBOMs and SBOM consumption all day long. The right frame is the one that you suggested, which is what is the status quo? And does broad adoption of SBOMs improve it? And I think it's hard to find people that would disagree with that proposition. But I think you can spin stories and not without justification that you could have misguided procurement guidelines that would simply be security checkboxes and not be useful. So I don't think it's the concerns to me aren't totally empty, but I still like the framing you proposed.
Yeah, I guess to play devil's advocate to my own, previous statement, you open a door to like kind of policy or regulatory things that simply don't make sense or are impractical. And one of those was like early versions of the NDAA, for example, had some language around vulnerability-free software.
Sure.
And that definitely had a knee-jerk reaction from industry about, wait, this makes no damn sense.
Right.
Yeah, it definitely can be dangerous, I think, if not framed correctly. And I think that there's, I actually want to ask you about that because you have an academic and a research background. How do you bridge the kind of policy, theoretical frame to the practitioner side of state of industry? Like, any thoughts around how we produce that coherent policy? How do we make sure we do that?
Yeah. Gosh, this is such a deep question. It's really beyond my research and direct knowledge. I only have anecdotal firsthand experience on this. I think the first point I would make is that I actually think that at least I'm going to talk about corporate industry and then academia. I actually think there are some shared unifying principles, though they are emphasized differently. But in both, you are seeking for truth. You want to know what is true about the world. And in academia, you do that through publishing papers and having peer review. And people point out when you're wrong and you don't get published if you're too wrong. And in the corporate world, you're actually using this truth seeking to try to create better products and services. If your mental model's totally busted and doesn't make sense, it's actually hard for you to operate to build a successful business. So I actually think that there's more overlap than at least the academics tend to think, where they say, the corporate world, it's just a bunch of suits, they don't know anything. I think that's silly and overblown. And I think there is a difference, though, that where academia is really a no-hold-bars environment. The corporate world's not like that. Researchers like myself and others, you have to actually be more careful. You're in an environment where not everyone else is a researcher, and the no-hold-bar style of debate mainly builds ill will and resentment, and gets you into sticky political situations that you'd wish to stay out of. So really, I think for me that, and I'm just talking about myself, the researcher out in society needs to play a more humble role than in academia, of helping uncover decisions that might not even be thought of as decisions, uncover options, weigh risks and benefits. But especially in democracy, I think some academics come out and think we should just have a perfect technocracy, and I fundamentally think that's flawed.
Yeah, I think you point out, the kind of the dangers of both perspectives or extremes, I guess, like between the practitioner versus academia and researchers. And honestly, I think we need like a collaboration between the two, because the practitioners, they have the ground truth of what the day-to-day, real world is like. But academia can also look at a large body of data and tell you, hey, there's actually a better way, or there's some things you're not thinking about. So I think that there's definitely opportunities there if we can get past thinking one extreme or the other is the only way. So I wanted to ask you, before we pivot from SBOM real quick here, I know there's, I'm throwing some things at you that we didn't pre-discuss.
That's fine.
I know there's a lot of interest around, moving beyond, not necessarily moving beyond, but just SBOM to things like VEX, the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange, that shows, not only what vulnerabilities are in the software, but also are they actually exploitable? What are your thoughts around how the industry is kind of moving towards VEX? And I know KanGuard has been involved with the VEX specification, or spec, I think it was, right?
Yeah. So this is actually part of some ongoing research I'm interested in. And I think there's really two costs, the vulnerabilities in software, and one gets a lot of attention and one to date has gotten a lot less, though OpenVex and others are bringing it to light. The part that's gotten a lot of attention is that vulnerabilities are an avenue for attackers to exploit your software, do things to your system and software you don't want. So that's bad. Of course, not all of them are severe. Some of them aren't exploitable, but in general, there are security risks. I think less explored is that there's actually a time cost to having so many vulnerabilities in your software. And that is that it takes a lot of human effort, expertise, time, toil, really, to deal with all the vulnerabilities in your software. Doing, people call them CVEs, for referring to the MITRE acronym, but going through CVEs in a long spreadsheet is a boring, toilsome job. It's actually can be quite difficult too. And that time cost has been unaccounted for. And I think one promising aspect of VEX and or VEX-like solutions is reducing the time cost of vulnerability management, so that you can actually then focus your time on the real, to your organization, critical or very severe, worth addressing vulnerabilities. So to me, that's why I'm excited about OpenVex. I'm doing some interview research actually right now on how much is this time cost of vulnerabilities? Is there this actually really important drain on large parts of the IT ecosystem that has been mostly unacknowledged or thought of as a secondary concern, which is, could it actually be a first-tier concern, but just nobody's taken the time to go and ask all these poor persons all over the place doing CVE triage.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point, especially when you look at like things like the ISC Square, cybersecurity state of the workforce study, and you see we have, allegedly or supposedly 3+ million, cybersecurity shortfalls, workforce shortfalls. How much time are we actually spending on meaningful activity versus toil and wasteful endeavors? And I actually just posted something from another company named Qualys yesterday that showed, based on their study, their research and data, that in 2022 there was, 25,000 CVEs, and like less than 1% of them were actually exploited in the wild that they know of. So that's a lot of time spent, chasing down vulnerabilities that are not even exploited or posing risk to the organization, for example. And then one more thing I want to throw out there for folks that really want to go down in the weeds on VEX. There's a lot of information out there about VEX, and also vulnerability disclosure reports you can dive into from NIST and CISA and others. So definitely check that topic out. One thing I also wanted to ask you about, and like I said, I'm kind of selfishly just diving into all the topics I know you have depth on, is SALSA, or supply chain levels for software artifacts. That has come out, a framework around software supply chain, and it's kind of a maturity model, and different tiers, like 1 through 4 of your security rigor and governance around software supply chain. So I'm curious, you mentioned that you're doing some research on that front. I'm curious to hear, what are you up to? What is SALSA? And also, what are you looking into when it comes to SALSA?
Yeah, SALSA is indeed a software supply chain security framework. I think of it, to borrow the language of the project itself, as an integrity framework, ensuring that there's been no tampering of your project. So it's not about vulnerability management, not about malicious dependencies, at least not directly. It's really about avoiding the next SolarWinds, some sort of tampering of your build system. It has an emphasis on provenance and documenting it thoroughly and having verified provenance. How is your software built? How did it go from source code to this binary? what I've been doing is there were a number of open source software foundations, the Eclipse Foundation, the Rust Foundation, the Open Source Security Foundation, and ChainGuard that actually jointly conducted a survey that we call SALSA++. It's about SALSA and then some other stuff too. But it's mostly about SALSA. And what it did is it asked about 170 software professionals around the world, what do you actually use from SALSA right now? How much? Do you think it's useful? Do you think it's easy or hard? And what it found was can be boiled down to 3 points. One is a lot of these SALSA practices individually are already adopted. That doesn't mean organizations are using SALSA necessarily. In fact, a lot of the respondents said they weren't even familiar with SALSA before the survey. But there's promising adoption trends already for individual security requirements from SALSA. Two, they are broadly perceived as useful. There's something a little strange about the data. Most of the controls are seen as similarly useful. So I think that could reflect like immaturity. Developers and software organizations are still figuring out which ones are more useful, but there's broad interest and receptiveness to them. And third, there are some that are considered much harder. They're the ones at the so-called top of the SALSA scale, at least the SALSA version 0.1, which is what we were using. And that's things like reproducible builds and hermetic builds, stuff that if you look into it, a lot of organizations do indeed say, oh, if we didn't design for that in our build architecture from the beginning, this is hard. So that's the SALSA research. I think it really, like many early stage research projects, it creates more questions as you answer a small number of them. But that's what we've been up to. You can find that. Thanks for the links.
Yeah, definitely. I found it really insightful to see the state of adoption and just perspectives of the SALSA framework. And I think it's also very promising, at least the framework itself, because we talked about CVEs, which are kind of lagging indicators of risk. There's a vulnerability at that point where SALSA is more focused on, like you talked about, good security practices, for example, that kind of give you some insight into the maturity of your software development practices, pre-CVE, which is good to know. And also, as you point out, I think like all maturity models, some organizations may be more well-resourced and capable than others, and maybe not even need to go such a, to level 4, for example, or whatever the case is. So I wanted to ask you, you also have a data science background, and my co-host, she couldn't make it today, but she wanted to ask, we're seeing a kind of a synergy or some harmony between cybersecurity and data science start to come together. And I'm curious your thoughts on that front.
Yeah. I hope they're becoming more harmonious. The honest truth is I'm not sure. Right when I kind of had a career pivot about 4 or 5 years ago, where I shifted more from public policy research to these topics. And I wrote a piece right at the beginning of my time at In-Q-Tel called Searching for the Science of Cybersecurity Data Science. And what I say is that I think there were some really important early successes in cybersecurity and data science before it was called this. Especially with spam detection and malware. If you go back to the earlier days of the internet in the 90s, there began to be this tremendous spam problem. And early machine learning techniques were actually really good at cutting down on it. And they're still in there. I'm sure Google and others are using much more sophisticated forms of this right now. And same with malware detection. But a little bit later, about 10 to 15 years ago, a bunch of companies started commercializing, after some academic research, sophisticated malware detection techniques that weren't just looking for a signature, but were using deep learning or something like it to search for malicious files, malicious executables. And these were very successful. And then I think what happened is a lot of people got excited and said, okay, great, we should be able to expand this to all cybersecurity topics. And I'm afraid that those early visions met with a lot of resistance, not because other people fought back, but because those early domains, spam and malware, were different. And the later domains like network traffic analysis and even open source software are very different. For instance, in spam, you have a lot of spam actually on the internet and very few good email. So when you build a data set of this, you actually have a lot of examples of the thing you're trying to avoid. Unfortunately, a lot of other cybersecurity examples are the exact opposite. The bad thing that you care about, the intrusion into an actual organization, is very rare, hard to observe. And when you do observe it, you can't just easily share that network traffic data because it contains sensitive information. My short story, and it's kind of a sob story, is I think there is these early success stories in this area, but there's a bunch of people like myself and others that have been very slowly pushing the frontiers of this, because it turns out the early successes are different than these later fields.
Yeah, it's really interesting the way you put that. And it also demonstrates, like, you got to be careful how you interpret the data or how you present it, because you can use it to present a certain narrative that may be inaccurate, right?
Right.
And I think that's really fascinating, where we see data science start to come into play with cybersecurity. So I want to ask, before we move towards the end of the show and talk about some of your, current research efforts, in the state of software supply chain security, like, you've been researching the topic for several years now. You're familiar with SALSA and SBOM and VEX, and you've seen the uptick in software supply chain attacks. As an industry, do you feel like, I know this is a bit speculative, but do you feel like we're moving in a good direction? Do you think we'll see an exponential continued increase of attacks, or do you think all these guidance and frameworks will help mitigate that, or where do you think we're headed in the next say 3 years?
Gosh, I only have a really disappointing answer for you. You and probably listeners will say, "Oh my gosh, what a cop out!" But I don't know. I do think it's true that there's a broad range of reports, including some that I've worked on, some that peers have worked on, that show that there's been this dramatic growth in a wide variety of what you might call software supply chain compromises over the past 10 years. It's true. Doesn't matter which researcher collects the data, how you slice and dice it, it's going up. And I think what the data can't tell you is what do these rising numbers really mean? Does it mean there are more attacks, or simply more attacks are observed? I'm not sure. The data can't tell you. I think on a more optimistic note, I can say that it is true that there is a palpable excitement among a number of parties and institutions, companies, foundations, individuals that are interested in open source software security and software supply chain security. It's hard to keep track of all the initiatives, which is a good thing. We want that. That means that there's redundancy built into our ecosystem, where should one initiative or group fail for any number of social or technical reasons, there's 50 others carrying the flag. So I actually think it's very exciting along those lines. I think it's, for persons who care about this topic, it's a great time to be involved. There's more money involved. There's more political attention, media attention. Those are all good things. Whether it's making a difference, hard to say, early days. And I don't think, unfortunately, that the attack data can really tell you, because it doesn't observe this key thing, which is how many software supply chain attacks are actually happening. Mixed feelings.
Yeah, no, that's a fair assessment. And it is a good sign. I mean, for the book I was working on, I tried to synthesize a lot of the existing guidance, and it was, NIST, NSA, CNCF, CIS, it just went on and on and on. Right. And there was so much.
Right.
It's a good sign. There's a lot.
Yeah, I think so too. I think some people are like, there should be consolidation. We should have a unified voice. And for me, that's much too totalitarian of an approach. I want this to be a vibrant civil society. Like what you hear about early America, everybody and their cousin that has some view on software supply chain security, I welcome it. I think it'll be good for you, me, and others.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Although I'll throw out there, we saw the National Cyber Strategy called for, harmonization of cybersecurity frameworks and requirements. So it could be, I think guidance great. A lot of guidance is great, but too many requirements from too many sources can be problematic and challenging too.
I agree.
Yeah. So I want to ask, final question with you, to let you go is, you mentioned working on some existing research you're focusing on right now with CVEs and such. Can you expand on that a little bit? And then, what can we expect to kind of learn or take away from, some of the insights potentially?
Yeah, I would say I'm doing two types of CVE related research right now. One is about empirically studying CVEs in containers. This is not a new field of research, but I think there are some unexamined aspects. Containers, I think of containers as really just a bunch of other open source software components, usually packaged together. It's like a mega open source software package. And if you think there are problems with any open source software package and the typical development, well, now multiply that, because now you often have hundreds of open source software packages put together and then frozen too, just like a normal version. So one thing I've been doing is I've actually created this data collection system that we call it Rumble internally. And what Rumble does is it collects data on a bunch of different containers every day with several different scanners. And one of the things that I've been doing in particular is I've been studying how fast are the reported CVE accumulation rates when you use one version of a container, a single hash and digest. And why this matters is a lot of organizations, you can't actually update all the time. That creates threats to the stability of your software. Your production could go down, or there can be other issues. So you often, when using containers, have to stick for at least a little while, sometimes a long while, with a single digest, a single version of a container. And so I've said, well, how fast, when you do that, how many CVEs are you creating for yourself? How fast does that grow? And though I haven't published it yet, I'll tell you, and this is meant to be provocative, but I'll say it's about a CVE a day. For popular containers, ones that often have on Docker Hub, and ones that often have hundreds of components. So if you, and then of course any organization probably has many so-called images they're using. So when you start to think about that, I think it should make organizations that are using containers nervous. They are quickly accumulating lots of CVEs unless they're constantly doing lots of updates. And unfortunately, they can't always do those updates because the upstream projects don't update that frequently. So that's research one. I'm glad to talk about it more, but I'll turn it back to you for a second if you want to ask anything. Or
no, I was going to say I think that's fascinating. I did want to make a kind of a plug for ChainGuard. I've leveraged a lot of their publications around disparities and different findings from container scanners. If you take the same container and scan it with different tools, you get different outputs, and that could be problematic if an organization's using one team's using this, one team's using that. That could be problematic. And then also you guys are doing some really cool stuff around base images, hardened secure base images to drive down vulnerabilities, which is really fascinating. But go on. I want to hear your the second research effort too.
Yeah, the second one is the one I alluded to earlier, which is about measuring the time costs. So I'm actually even recruiting for this survey right now. So if you're interested, you can get in contact with me, LinkedIn or otherwise. But I want to know how much time are organizations that deploy or build containers, how much time are their engineers and security teams actually spending on CVE triage? I think there's actually been a little bit of research on this, but it's been quick and relatively shallow. So I'm trying to do interviews, really get in-depth knowledge about how much time is this taking, what are the perceived pain points, how many people are actually doing this, how much confidence can even be had. So this is a more open-ended study. It's based on interviews, so it won't be easy to summarize. But that's what I'm up to. And if you are, if you want to recommend people yourself, or listeners want to get in contact to talk about it, I welcome it. So.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds really interesting. I work with some organizations that, have container-based platforms and environments that maybe I'll send them your way to try and chat. And one other thing I think, just an idea to check out, I know you're always doing research. One thing I found fascinating is when I was working on the book, we've seen the growth of CVEs, and I always, I looked at it and wondered, what factors play a part in that? Is it the growth of CNAs, groups that can actually submit CVEs? Is it the growth of the pervasiveness of technology? Is software just more vulnerable, or is there more software? Those kind of factors.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah. So I'm interested in that topic too. And then obviously EPSS, I'd be curious your perspective on EPSS, but that's something we can nerd out on some other time. The exploitability or probability of exploitability of CVEs, for example. So that all that said, I really wanted to say I thank you for taking the time today to come chat with us. And for folks that want to follow you, your work, your research, where else can they find you? You mentioned LinkedIn. Are you pretty active?
Yeah, I think ChainGuard's website is an easy place. We do have a blog where I write, but we also have a lab section. I co-lead ChainGuard Labs, our R&D arm. And I also have a personal website too. You can just Google John Speed Meyers, johnspeedmeyers.com. Thanks so much. And I just wanted to say I applaud you too for both your professional work and your writing on this topic. I think you've actually become one of the leading advocates for this topic. And I think that's a very valuable service to this community. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. I've been following your work and I really have learned a lot and cited you at least, 2 to 3 times or more in the book. So you'll be in there. Don't worry.
Oh, great.
And then that said, that's going to take us out for today. So thanks to everyone that tuned in and definitely check out our episode next week. Thank you.